The cypherpunks were very interested in any kind of self-sovereignty and privacy and encryption kind of technology, and electronic cash was the holy grail, the top-tier target.
Hal Finney himself, when he first came into contact with Bitcoins, his initial reaction was, oh, if this takes off, each one will be worth $10 million. That was his initial reaction. So in some sense, number go up is a cypherpunk value.
Bitcoin is not like the Genesis quote about the chancellor being on the brink of a second bailout.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Goldstein and Adam Back.
It's wonderful to be here in Nashville. It's great to have such an esteemed audience, and I'm honored to be able to talk to one of the OG cypherpunks, longtime Bitcoiner, father of Hashcash, which is the mining algorithm. And today we're going to be talking about a bit of the future of Bitcoin and how not to break it. But before we get into that, I want to think about the past and the present and how that plays into that future. So going back into the past, you have a long history within the cypherpunk movement itself. Before Bitcoin existed, they worked on a lot of digital cash projects. But what was it about Bitcoin that made it unique among the cypherpunk digital cash projects? Were there problems that they did not consider? Solutions they didn't see? What was it that made Bitcoin unique?
Yeah, I think that the main cypherpunk idea that got built for electronic cash was the digicash system. And it was, it had certain properties which were just side effects of its design. So it was effectively a stablecoin. It was extremely private because using David Chaum's technology, but it was centralized and there was no way to audit how many coins they'd issued. And so the centralized infrastructure, so that if the company that was developing the technology failed, you'd lose the double spend database and then it would be game over. So that was the fate of it. And so when digicash failed, people tried to draw lessons from what went wrong. And of course, the cypherpunks were very interested in any kind of self-sovereignty and privacy and encryption kind of technology. And electronic cash was the holy grail, the top-tier target, which was much harder to build. So digicash failing didn't cause them to give up, but to kind of, try and draw some lessons and figure out how to work around those problems. And so it was in that context when I proposed Hashcash as a kind of proxy digital cash that was easier to build to combat some kind of targeted spam that was trying to sort of do a false flag and discredit or attack or cause other people to attack privacy networks, that Hashcash became part of that conversation because it answered one of those questions, which is the digicash failure was partly difficulty in getting and maintaining a banking relationship and just that dependence. They could cut you off at any time, right? And so with the mining algorithm, people recognized that this was an alternative way. You don't need a bank account if you can mine coins into existence, and that creates a cost, and then you could let the free market tell you what the value is. So that kind of free market valuation concept wasn't really articulated clearly or realized generally until Bitcoin, I think.
Yeah, so basically having the base money sort of reserve currency that the eCash is built on, and also the fact that it ends up being this fixed supply, this finite supply, makes it more capable of taking on a sort of economic growth that just having digicash does not, play a role in.
Right. Digicash was effectively like a Tether stablecoin, and so it didn't have an investment thesis. So, people were very excited about digicash because the privacy and the bearer cash and the possibility for smart contracts and to, contract anonymously on the internet, that was all very interested in in future-casted free money worlds with less government and things like that. So that people like myself were very interested in that future, and DigiCash seemed like a building block until it failed. So, but it's not fully clear with Bitcoin if it was just trying to find a solution to the external dependency to the banking world, and the hard money aspect was an accident or a design. Evidently, it was the only solution that anybody had come up with that could be used, because all of the previous kind of prototype ideas like Weidai's B-Money, Nick Szabo's BitGold, Hal Finney's RPow were all using proof of work because it's all we had, right? And Bitcoin does the same thing. And so it ends up being another adoption driver for Bitcoin, which is people start to invest in it as a speculation or longer term as a store of value. And so here we are today, where a lot of the adoption driver is actually the asset class or the speculative investment. Sometimes people start using Bitcoin for different reasons. There were some people who were into online gambling, poker playing, and the poker sites would get cut off by credit cards and by PayPal and things. And so the poker sites would adopt Bitcoin. And so there are people who ended up with Bitcoin because they were avid poker players, and it's a gray market activity in some jurisdictions. And there are other people who got into it speculatively or for technical curiosity, but then it seems, Bitcoin seems to change people's outlook because of its monetary properties and its dependability, ultimately.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see it all come full circle now that we have Xiaomi and digital cash being built on Bitcoin. So it all continues together. And that kind of brings us, a question that I have about the present for someone like you is we have a seeming dichotomy between people who have more of a kind of cypherpunk, Bitcoin pleb view of Bitcoin, of a very, very strong ethical principles about what Bitcoin ought to be, and they juxtapose that with what they call the suit coiners, the number go up bros, the moon boys, like that kind of, the treasury companies and all of that. But from your perspective, you've been a part of all of it, including the treasury companies now, as well as, cypherpunk development, what are things that you think that those two sides can learn from one another?
Well, I think, people may read into the cypherpunk name itself that these guys are anarchists who are drawing graffiti on buildings, but actually they were, very economically savvy anarcho-capitalists, right? So they were arguing for free market, sort of private organization by companies, just anonymously on the internet. And so, most of the wealth in society is indirectly created by the mechanism of capital formation and the ability for groups of humans to organize as companies. So, once Bitcoin evolves into a store of value, I think it's very logical that companies would defensively also want to protect their cash reserves by acquiring Bitcoin. And you can see that in the articulation that Michael Saylor used for his thought process of how he arrived at using Bitcoin as a treasury asset, which was not exactly philosophical. It was more self-protective, that he could see this melting ice cube as he saw it shrinking at the rate of 10 or 15% a year that he'd spent decades accumulating through the hard work with the staff at his company. And so he was looking for anything, real estate, gold, whatever could do the job, right? And he realized that Bitcoin could be the solution, and then started on that process. And of course, it took a surprisingly long time before anybody chose to follow in his footsteps, which was a bit surprising. So I think one of the interesting realizations with Bitcoin is that people can sort of slow motion win and, proselytize and try to persuade people to follow them and to be rational and to protect themselves, and they will calmly do nothing for like half a decade against their own self-interest. So it seems that people are much more prone to the status quo and much less open-minded and adaptive than you would think, but eventually the economic forces take hold. And Safety Namus has some interesting things to say with the Bitcoin standard, but listening to him speak on videos where he's spoken at events, which is to say the person with the harder money has such a huge economic advantage that it's not really optional to adopt Bitcoin. If you don't, you get demonetized, you suffer capital reallocation, and ultimately you will have to adopt later, but have lost a lot of kind of economic relevance in the world as a company or a fund manager or as an individual. it'll be to your disadvantage. And so I think that's an interesting way to look at it, which is it's not really, in the way he says it, a political statement. It's a kind of pragmatic self-defense statement. But of course, for the cypherpunks and the people interested in free markets philosophically, Bitcoin is great.
Yeah, I think also for the cypherpunks, the engineering tactics, those are the practical means to do what needs to be done. Hal Finney himself, when he first came into contact with Bitcoin, so when Satoshi posted on the cryptography mailing list, his initial reaction was, oh, if this takes off, each one will be worth $10 million. That was his initial reaction. So in some sense, number go up is a cypherpunk value. The cypherpunks were also, you made the technology, but it's not meant to just be you guys holding it. It's like, how do we proliferate this so that more people can use this? And as you're describing, number go up itself is the means to proliferate a new monetary system, because the monetary system that you want to use is the one that's most liquid.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the sense that people will start to use Bitcoin or invest in Bitcoin or find a need to transact with Bitcoin, because they got debanked or because they were trying to do some gray market activity or some remittance or bypass of capital control or whatever their story is that they came into it. But it does start to change their mindset, because I think having an asset that provides a very high rate of return encourages saving in an extreme way. So, some cultures will do a very high rate of saving versus consumer spending. And with Bitcoin, that, exposes that type of thinking, kind of naturally brings about that type of thinking, just because you can look at it and it's very apparent, right, that if something is growing at 50, 60% and decaying per year, that compounding for decades, that if every $1,000 you spend this year is going to be millions less that you might have in the far future. And so it's probably a good idea to save today, and then that brings people to the chair memes when they're selling all of their things. And there are people who've literally sold up, basically put all of their assets into Bitcoin.
Yeah. So we've kind of brought it to that present. How do we make sure that this proliferation of Bitcoin continues and in a way that upholds the values that holds Bitcoin together? Both the serious cypherpunk stuff as well as the kind of number go up, working as a monetary system. How might the design change over time, or might we expect it to more ossify?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was always a question for me going back 5 years ago or more, how would Bitcoin continue to scale socially? Because in the early days, Bitcoin value, I think, came from people mining it and valuing the craft value psychologically. If you build something with your own hands, you tend to ascribe a value to it, and then groups of people engaging in this crafting of mining Bitcoin and puzzling how to program and configure graphics cards or plug in as ASICs, ascribe value, and then that started the market. But I think there's a question mark about what would happen as it went upstream and you got public companies and people without the cypherpunk outlook who may look at it from a more pragmatic point of view. And if you start to get politicians and governments and public companies and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds investing in Bitcoin, if the incentives that hold the Schelling point together would come unstuck and something would go wrong. And the impression I've had over the last few, since that 5 years, is that the Bitcoin incentives actually seem to be quite scalable, and it seems to change the mindset of the organizations and individuals, whether they're politicians or individual technical enthusiasts or free market enthusiasts. So it seems to be quite scalable, which is good. And I think, because part of the concern about the scalability is that Bitcoin is having to evolve a bit technologically to fix bugs or to add features to support layer 2 so that it can be scaled in a way that protects the security of it. And so, there are risks potentially that governments might try to centralize it or impose monetary policies on top of it. And so far, that seems to not have been the case. I mean, because what you want is for the governments to treat it in the same way that they treat gold, which is that it's just an immutable thing and you rely on it or you don't. Not that you get in there and you try to redefine how much you sort of make an alloy of gold and copper or something because you want to debase it, right? So we've got to get people out of that mindset. So far that seems to have scaled, and I think one question mark is when the changes come, when you have to make a bug fix or a soft fork to add a feature to support more scalability or more layer 2 security, that there becomes risk when there are more governments and policymakers involved. And so there might be a case to try to get to ossification before it gets too big, but we're already quite far along, right? But I think ultimately Bitcoin would be okay if it ossified today. Not ideal, but it would be okay. And so I think for the far future, topically for your initiatives with the Nakamoto Institute, we need to sort of transfer these understandings about the Schelling point and the need for human understanding about the Schelling point and respect for it. Like it's not something that you want to get to, create too much social drama to try and change it because maybe it's displaceable or possible to knock it into a weaker point. I mean, I think the block size wars were a very good test for that, and a lot of people drew strength from the fact that, the individual investor and the minority were able to prevail, because ultimately what makes something robust is that a minority can exert their rights and not be censored and not have their assets frozen, and that proves to be the case. But, we hope that that stays robust into the future, so there is a certain amount of drawing the right lessons from the block size wars and other things about how it works and why it works, and transferring them into the future, because sometimes knowledge about things sort of fades and people have simplified rules of thumb, which may not be good intuitions for for the future necessarily.
Yes, and sometimes they can also draw the wrong conclusions about why something may have even gone right.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe a little bit like religions where the reason, which may have been scientific in its time for some recommendation, is kind of lost and now becomes a mantra or something, right? Which people will interpret literally, sometimes with the incorrect understanding, ultimately.
Given this sort of view of you have many different people with many different incentives, mostly centered around, number go up, but you have all of these different parties that have their interests, including ones that might have interests that, are contrary to a lot of those that other Bitcoiners want. I sort of think of it as a big Mexican standoff that sort of governs the Bitcoin network. Given that, and sort of a view that ossification is something that you would expect to happen in the future, but even, maybe closer, for people who are wanting to build on Bitcoin and build for Bitcoin, how does that affect how they should be thinking about building with the long term in mind?
Well, I think people who have tried to contribute to large-scale open source systems of, whether that's Bitcoin or Linux or some other major system, generally they either adapt to that environment where it's slow-paced and you have to rely on consensus from other people to agree that your change is safe and good and get review on it. So it's a sort of game for the patient who are willing to just sort of patiently wait or happy for their proposal to never happen, sort of open-mindedness. So I think that's quite important in Bitcoin, and certainly many, many people who have found themselves on a path where they've tried to force a change to Bitcoin, that has without exception resulted in them not achieving that change. And how they handle that, some people will just roll with it, right, and say, well, that idea didn't work. Let's, move on to the next idea and see if there's consensus for that. And other people will, butt heads with it. And ultimately, Bitcoin is not a kind of political system. There's no governance process. It's like a commodity. And so you're pretty much running into a brick wall. And so they kind of rage quit or something. And you see there's a long history of people who've tried to change Bitcoin and run into that brick wall, because Bitcoin is not like the Genesis quote about the chancellor being on the brink of a second bailout. You can't plead with Bitcoin for moral hazard, right? It's just going to keep mining the next block. So I think people have to keep an open mind and look for technical and ecosystem consensus on changes should be backwards compatible, safety first, and really trying to sort of make careful changes that just sort of improve security, scalability, efficiency, or transference of security into layer twos. I think those are the critical things at this point.
Yeah, thinking on more of the social side of things, Bitcoin obviously disintermediates many types of institutions. And many Bitcoiners are very fond of talking about things like, sovereign individuals and such. And yet, institutions, reputation, and so on are things that the cypherpunks had always talked about. Cryptography as a means to actually make even stronger permanent institutions built around things like reputation. What kind of institutions do you think will see more disintermediated? Obviously, something like a central bank is an obvious one, but maybe some less obvious ones. And what are some institutions that you actually think will maybe even grow stronger because of cryptography and Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, people sometimes call Bitcoin a truth machine because you can verify the chain and it's a self-evident truth about who holds and controls coins. I do wonder if you get this kind of separation of money from state, that in the long run will result in more individual sovereignty, less state involvement in the money supply and in a distribution of money, the redistribution of money, and sort of with Bitcoin you can also sort of opt out of inflation. And I think there's a natural incentive for everyone to want to opt out of inflation. And so as that progresses and gets adopted by more governments and more countries and more individuals, I think it ultimately defunds a lot of excessive government spending. And if you defund things, it's a non-conflict way to reduce their influence in the world. And of course, different types of establishments have faded and changed over time. So I think this could be the kind of peaceful revolution to reduce the adverse influence of government in the world by defunding ultimately.
Yeah, it seems like we've already seen the development of interesting financial institutions because of Bitcoin, in the sense of we have things like collaborative custody, where now instead of using a financial intermediary because you want them to hold on to everything and have unilateral control of your money as a trade-off to be able to provide services, we can now think in a more Bitcoin native way where we're sort of able to unbundle those things and you have the unilateral control, but these institutions are able to define themselves by a reputation of being able to access capital, work with the needs of a family, which is something, and other businesses that are going to have sort of multi-generational needs, and be able to have that. So I think that's like a good example of how things would change. And they kind of have a resemblance to a classic bank, but is reshaped into a sort of Bitcoin native form.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could see certainly the long time preference, the idea that people start to care about and think about and plan for the future could result in a new renaissance. I mean, in a lot of ways, modern society is kind of built around the artifacts of a previous, more forward-looking era. So I think it'd be good to see a re-emergence of a long-term value-driven society and institutions around that. So it takes some creativity to rebuild institutions without, the central authority. But ultimately, there were periods in history where they're like that, and we can, explore and rebuild those. So I think that's actually, sort of brings about a brighter, more wholesome future in a way. It's quite interesting talking with Bitcoiners that they will often have quite philosophical views about, new forms of institution that are sort of built around the sovereign individual ultimately.
Yes. Well, just wrapping up, looking deep into the future, it seems like you're bullish. You continue to, stick around Bitcoin with the rest of us. But, are there any risks that you do think about when it comes to the deep future?
Well, I think, the kind of game theory, economic game theory, scalability, I feel better about that now that I've seen, different governments mining and building Bitcoin positions, public companies, politicians, even the current US administration being quite pro-Bitcoin, that it seems that Bitcoin has made that transition in a surprisingly smooth way, where it was less clear to forecast that. So as long as things keep in that dimension, I think we're on a good track, actually.
It seems like Bitcoin was built to win. Well, thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.